Changing Developer Agreements, a webinar for all NSP grantees and their partners. This webinar will inform NSP grantees about crafting strong developer agreements and negotiating amendments of existing developer agreements that have proved to be unworkable. Participants will learn how to structure and negotiate workable provisions for timely performance, budget controls, developer compensation, subsidy amounts, flow of funds, long-term affordability requirements, grantee approval of plans and budgets for individual homes, monitoring, enforcement, and other key points of developer agreements. The webinar will also address how RFPs, RFQs, and policies and procedures documents should be compatible with and reinforce developer agreements. It will highlight available toolkits and technical assistance for follow-up. This webinar is interactive, and participants will have an opportunity for questions and answers during and after the completion of the presentation. So with us today is Peter Werwath. He is with Enterprise Community Partners located in Columbia, Maryland. And from HUD's NSP office, we have or will have John Laswick with us, and we do have Hunter Kurtz. And they're here to help us field your questions at those appropriate times. So greetings to all of you. And I will now turn the proceedings over to Peter. Hi, Peter.
And thank you, and welcome everyone. Kent has already described the session, so I'll just briefly go over the agenda in the order of topics that we're going to cover. The first thing is really the context that developer agreements need, as Kent mentioned, to be compatible with RFPs, RFQs, and policies procedures. We'll look at the key provisions of developer agreements, and things that you've already mentioned will come up in this section where we're down into the real details of developer agreements, how to negotiate them, what some of the key points to include would be, how to solve problems, deal structure, scope of services, compensation, one group of topics, and then control over flow of funds and net proceeds. We know that the net proceeds of home sales is an issue that often comes up and wasn't always addressed in some of the earlier NSP developer agreements. We'll talk about deal underwriting criteria and then contract monitoring enforcement. Again, these four general points I just made are we're going to talk about in terms of what to put in developer agreements. We're not going to be able to go into very much depth in these and solve underwriting problems or budgeting problems, so we will cover issues that you bring up as well as we can, but the main subject is developer agreements. And then there will be a section on negotiating changes. You know, what gives you the right to do that? Can it be done voluntarily? Can you put sort of pressure on developers in certain circumstances to change agreements? That's what that part is about. And then finally, where to go for templates and assistance, and then we'll have an open Q&A at the end. But as Kent mentioned, because there's a lot of material here, we're going to take a couple of breaks. So next slide. So we've got some comments. I don't want to address these immediately. I just wanted to hear kind of what the some of your larger concerns were, and let me just address these comments that are over in the Q&A box very quickly. We will get to make sure we get to the question about nonprofits providing second mortgage assistance and holding the note. We'll get to that. Subrecipient agreements, developer fee was paid. How do we remedy the situation? We'll get to that. The simple answer is to amend the subrecipient agreement into a developer agreement. It's the best we can say, and we'll get to how you might negotiate that. Bidding out, I'll make a note of that. We'll get to that under the requirements you're putting on developers. Again, I don't want to answer all these questions now. We'll keep things in order, but we'll make sure we get to that. Not incurring program income. We'll certainly talk about how to structure, the difference between program income to a subrecipient and the fact that net proceeds or other income to developers are not immediately program income. So we'll get back to that. And then account for unexpected costs. Well, a simple answer is contingencies. And there was a comment 2 minutes ago, I can't hear you. So, Kent, can you come on and address that?
Yes. If you can't hear, if that's still true, then you can't hear what I'm going to tell you, which would be to click the info tab in the upper left of your screen and call back in using that information there.
Okay, thank you, Kent. So again, this wasn't a time to answer questions. It was a kind of reality check to hear what you want to learn about, and we will make sure we cover all those in the Q&A period. We want to proceed in logical order. So the learning objectives of this session are that participants will gain knowledge that helps them structure agreements and related policies and procedures, RFPs, RFQs, all of which work together to encourage timely performance, maximize production, and get the community impacts that we're all looking for from the NSP program. It allows sufficient grantee oversight and controls. There was a comment made about, the developers not bidding out the jobs. How do we make sure that happens? I guess another question is, do you want to require bidding? But certainly the controls you want should be in the agreement if they're reasonable. And then controlling costs. There are several parts of the agreement, budgets, limits on expenditures, and so forth that can control costs and conserve your subsidy funds so they go further. And there's certainly handling of the net proceeds of sale. Proper handling of that will give you funds that can be recycled. And then finally, we're going to show you where to go to get document templates that address these very issues, and also to get technical assistance to help adapt your agreements that you have in better form, or to take one of these templates and create a new agreement. So the context, again, as we mentioned in the beginning, these developer agreements don't exist all by themselves, and they shouldn't cover every detail. A developer agreement normally is not a policies procedures manual, and if you don't have one, you're going to have to make some allowances. We strongly suggest that you adapt one, say, from your home program, or use one of the templates on the NSP toolkit to create a policies procedures manual, because things go much better if there is a manual that follows really the course, the progress of a project from acquisition through construction, through rental or sale of the unit, sort of step-by-step fashion, and has all the procedures and references to forms and so forth, so both the developer and the agency staff will know what to do at that point. And if you were to do this and had a good program manual, it does not have to be recited, cut and pasted into a developer agreement. It can be incorporated by reference. It's a roadmap and a rule book for developers and staff. And I think we all become aware that we're these policies and procedures are lacking. There's lack of clarity. There can be loss of control by a grantee and some results that you don't want happening. So there are two sample program manuals from the NSP toolkit. They're both single family. One's for ownership programs, home sale programs. The other's for rental development. And it's, as I mentioned, essentially a policies procedures document following the steps of the development process in sequence. We find that sequential layout of a program manual really makes them more readable and understandable, you know, step one, step two, etc., rather than having sections on, say, you know, compliance with this issue, compliance with that, more of a topical organization. It can become a little more confusing, but in any case, it needs to be clear and understandable by staff and developers. There are complementary, we mean coordinated, related RFQs and developer agreement forms in these toolkits, particularly the single-family toolkit. In the multifamily toolkit, there is not a, at least the last time I looked, there was not a procedures manual per se, but in multifamily, there are definitely very excellent RFP, RFQ forms for different approaches to selecting developers. And instead of a developer agreement under multifamily, you will see typically examples of loan agreements. The assumption with a multifamily project is that one of the easiest, most effective ways to enter into agreement with a developer is simply loan them the funds and put in the usual liens and regulatory agreements and so forth that go with a loan, even if it's a soft subsidy loan that doesn't require monthly payments. But certainly none of these documents should contradict one another, and they should minimize redundancy. So if you have, say, an RFQ for developers, then a program manual and a developer agreement, it's very important they don't contradict one another, because they can undermine your ability to enforce the agreement. So let's talk for a moment about deal structure. And by deal structure, we mean it's just sort of broad brush what's happening between the grantee and the developer. And one of the key issues we find is this an agreement for a single identified property? That's fine if it's a large project, and it's probably most appropriate. But we find a lot of agencies are using like a single property agreement for whole pipelines of single-family homes, and it does, in some cases, slow things down, depending on the approval process. So we've found some grantees have allowed, for lack of a better word, a blanket agreement that covers multiple homes, can speed up acquisition and processing. It basically gives the developer an allocation of funds, but of course not a transfer of funds, and they can draw against that allocation as they're acquiring properties. They don't have to go out, identify, get under site control 5, 10, or 20 homes, and then come in and apply and get approved. In the meantime, possibly losing control of some of those homes. It allows more of a pipeline approach. Developers can be more nimble, but you do need to guard with this system that you have very tight underwriting, oversight checkpoints, where you do not release funds, you do not approve purchases, you do not approve construction scopes of work, unless they're submitted to you and approved by you. We'll get to one of the questions that came up earlier. Of course, I think almost everyone's aware by now, there are two major kinds of agreements. developer agreements and subrecipient agreements. The developer agreement allows for a percentage fee or a fixed dollar amount developer fee. It allows developers to designate contractors. It addresses another question that came up. No, they don't have to bid. You can require them to bid, and we'll get to that in the discussion. There's some good reasons to go both ways here. And there's a lot more flexibility with the usual federal administrative and financial rules. Subrecipient agreement is required for all public entities, including public housing authorities, and under the NSP program, any co-grantees. It's cost reimbursement only. There are no fees, percentage, or fixed fees allowed, and procurement and other rules are more strict. And so to address the question that came up earlier, again, the answer there would be if the subrecipient is willing, I would say your best approach would be to sit down and renegotiate the agreement and turn it into a developer agreement. A number of grantees have done that. Now, it sounds like in your question, maybe you can phrase that when we have the open question again, and we can get into the details. But if it's about activities that's going on in the past, there probably should be a preamble in the agreement saying this replaces a previous agreement. You might even recite the fact that there was some incorrect terms, and that's now being corrected retroactively. I definitely consult with your attorney about the wording of this developer agreement. It should reference back to the subrecipient agreement and activities that went on under that agreement. And I don't know that we can say a lot more about that by long distance without knowing about the deal or the agreement, but you can bring it up on the open mic section if you like. Okay, let's see. I need to advance this. The scope of work. A developer can play multiple roles, and I'm not sure everyone's well aware of this, but the developer can also be a general contractor, can also be a home sales agent in a case where there's no broker being hired, and what you might call add-on fees, additional fees are allowed, but they must be reasonable. So, for instance, a developer could get a 10 or 15% developer fee, a normal overhead and profit amount for being general contractor in addition to that, because it's a different function, and also a reasonable sales fee of 4, 5, or 6%, whatever the prevailing rate might be, for marketing and selling the home. Timing of fees, a lot of grantees are doing these in stages. Some don't. Some pay them all at the end, which is better for deep pocket developers. A lot of nonprofits, especially the smaller ones, can't float their internal costs for the 3, 4, 5, 6 months, maybe even longer, that it takes to rehab and sell a home. So you could consider doing this in stages. It's perfectly fine. We see some agreements that have a third on acquisition, a third on completion of rehab or construction, and a third on sale. That's a fairly common structure, but not the only one. Scope of work should also be very clear about who does what, who's completing the environmental review work. Some grantees require the developer to do certain legwork, fill out forms, provide information. Other grantees handle this entirely themselves without any developer involvement, so you got to be clear about that. Who takes the application for NSP assistance and does the income certification? We know that not every beneficiary buying a home signed an application to get the home and to get the second mortgage assistance, but it's an awfully good practice to have that application. form where you're taking the information from the client. It's certainly done informally, but it's much better to call it an application, consider it an application, and to say yes or no, this is approved, you're moving ahead, or not. It's just a better way of doing business. So the question is, who handles that? It's often the developer. The developer often has to collect the information for the income certification. Sometimes they're asked to complete it, keep it on file, and sometimes the grantee looks at the information and completes the certification. Other questions like who provides home buyer counseling? Who does a grantee consider capable of doing that, experienced and able to help folks actually take care of their credit problems, be able to buy a home? If it's a rental property, who will manage it? So a lot of times on a bigger project, these roles are filled and understood and referenced in the developer's proposal, but if it's a blanket agreement for a number of single-family homes, perhaps some of these roles, like the counseling role, are not identified. The broker, the real estate broker role, and these are very important concerns of a grantee, that these be capable people doing the counseling, selling homes, and so forth. So we advise that an agreement, if it doesn't identify who's doing these things, has selection criteria, and the grantee has a right to approve or deny those selections. Delivery schedule, we see a lot of agreements that don't have one. They just have a final completion date. Maybe the developer was given hundreds of thousands of dollars in the funding allocation to complete multiple homes, and there's just one due date. We don't think that's advisable. It doesn't give you much control, and so it should have intermediate deadlines and milestones, and we have some samples of that that we're going to refer to at the end that are available as downloads from the HUD's Learning Center, and also they're in the NSP toolkit. So we're going to stop now and take some questions just on the subject matter we've covered so far. The next section is going to be on budgets, net proceeds of sale, more of the compensation issues. So if we could restrict the questions to the subjects we've covered so far, we'd appreciate it.
Sure. So James has a concern, and he was one of the ones who submitted originally. He said one of his concerns is about scope of work, I guess. How to account for unexpected costs that come up later after the agreement?
Well, there can be two levels of contingency allowed in the budget. There can be a construction contingency, and it's usually advisable to have 10% for rehab, maybe 5% for new construction. But there also could be a development contingency line that could be used for overruns and things like soft costs, holding costs, and so forth. I think the biggest there's a little danger in having a development contingency is that people who have a contingency like that will go find expenses to charge against the NSP funding. So you may want to think long and hard before you do that, but I think the biggest insurance for unexpected costs is just doing a careful budget and a cash flow projection over months. The things that tend to run over are construction, which can come from not having real tight specs or a good estimate in the beginning. So that's a quality control thing, or not having a contingency. But the other costs that might overrun would be holding costs. So doing a very careful estimate of those in advance would be important. If it's happened and you got to deal with it, you would have to amend the agreement to increase the funding if these are approvable costs and reasonable costs. Kent, do you want to take some more questions?
Yeah, let's see what else we have here.
How about the one on habitat?
Sure. Habitat.
A couple of them. There's one, the subrecipient agreement with Habitat includes a developer agreement for each house.
I think that's a follow-up to his original point, which says, I'm very concerned that the developer is not bidding out all the jobs for the individual homes.
Well, they're not required to as a developer. They're not subject to the procurement rules that a grantee or subgrantee or subrecipient would be affected by. That being said, you do need to verify the cost reasonableness of their construction budgets, so that if there are no bids, you certainly need to do your own independent estimate of costs and to see if there, obviously there has to be a work write-up or scope of work, plans and specs for the home. And it's really the grantee's responsibility to review all that and make sure the costs are reasonable and complete and nothing's left out. If you want to require them to bid, you need to put that requirement in the developer agreement. So I'm going down to the other question from Carl Freeman. And the city subrecipient agreement with Habitat includes a developer agreement for each house. Well, that's a bit of a muddle. We'd suggest that you send the complete details to, say, the Ask a Question on the NSP website, or request technical assistance, which can be provided remotely. The problem I see you have is that apparently there's a master agreement that's a subrecipient agreement, and underneath that it apparently authorizes a developer agreement for each individual house, and that sounds like a problem, because if it's characterized as a subrecipient agreement, say a top-level agreement, it'd be my opinion you could not pay fees to Habitat. It would have to be cost reimbursable. And I don't think that you should consult your attorney and the technical assistance providers, but a subordinate agreement to a subrecipient agreement, in my opinion, could not truly be a developer agreement. So, and it's a kind of case-specific issue. We just can't get into it any more than that. Unfortunately, we please present your specifics to ask a question or ask for on-call TA. But thanks for asking that question.
And we have John Laswick. Hi, John. Did you have anything to add to this or another answer?
No, I was just going to make a point earlier when Peter's was talking about the scope of services and who has which roles and responsibilities, is that there's been some confusion that we need to correct on one of our policy alerts, but it gives one of the policy alerts from last summer, August of 2010, makes it sound like you can't have a developer that provides housing counseling services, and what that means is you can't have the developer as the developer doing it, but if they have an approved housing counseling agency, they can also do that, but it needs a separate contract. So it's kind of a fine point, but I think some people have gotten a little frustrated with that. I would second Peter's assessment of that most recent question, though, that once you've got a subrecipient agreement, I think it's kind of hard to turn that around in a subsidiary agreement. So we can work with you on those.
Thank you, John. Kent, do you want to take some telephone questions?
Yeah. Let's go to Jennifer. Hi, Jennifer. Jennifer Morrison, are you there?
I am here.
Great. So you gave us some more information about your original question was about subrecipient agreement, and maybe that should be turned into a developer agreement. So go ahead.
Well, this is just, I love that word muddle that you use, because this is what this is. So in the beginning, we had a subrecipient agreement, I would say like about, I don't know, $1.4 million, first-time home buyer. In the subrecipient agreement, they allowed the developer, we weren't here then, don't we all say that anyway, they allowed $25,000 up front, sort of an and-bid cost, and then for every house sold, they had a developer fee of about $15,000 per house. And this is all under a subrecipient agreement. So now 80% of the grant is expended. Of course, the nonprofit was also providing housing counseling, and this is before all of the clarification came out. So now we're really trying to fix this because they should not have been receiving a developer fee under a subrecipient agreement. But it's really a challenge for our local HUD office because we're 80% through. At one time, we were going to amend the subrecipient agreement to become kind of two parts. One, a developer agreement for the acquisition rehab, and then a subrecipient agreement for the housing counseling portion. But that doesn't, I think HUD's concern is, since we're so far along, is that really a good way to go? So I was just wondering if you had any examples of other localities that have worked their way through this, because I'm sure we're probably not the only one.
John, I'm going to have to ask you to give your advice on this one. I said earlier I felt that just based on the facts before us here, that going back and rewriting the agreement, retroactively declaring that the original agreement had some internal conflicts or whatever the case may be, but that it's probably better to go back and fix it than do nothing. And I think the idea of breaking it into a developer agreement and a counseling subrecipient agreement is very typical, and it would be what I would advise. John, do you have any concerns about that retroactivity, or is this something they should discuss with the field office? Or what's your advice?
Sounds like she's doing that already. I mean, you're correcting a problem one way or the other. I don't think there's any big philosophical problem with making that kind of a change, whether it makes more sense to change it retroactively or just to sort of adjust it retroactively. For example, I mean, probably the biggest thing is the fee. So you got to look at, what do they use that fee for? I mean, is that really just what a subrecipient would have received as activity delivery costs? If it is, then maybe you can just characterize it that way. Probably it isn't. I mean, probably activity delivery costs are buried in total development costs where most developers put them. In which case, I think we might have to sit down with your. What's your field office telling you on this? Do they have
we're working with Angela Riviere and Michael Flores. We're in the Phoenix area, but I think it's I liked what you said originally about in the resolution and the preamble portion. I mean, you could really explain that by even recent HUD clarification of rules established have changed. I think there's a way to do it, and I think it's cleaner to redo it, really.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the first question I'd ask is, has there been any kind of harm done in the sense of overpayments or underperformance or anything like that? I mean, if you're happy with the work that's been done and you feel that the compensation's been fair for the amount of work that's been done and is in line with other comparable developments in your area, then I wouldn't have a problem going back and saying, look, what we really meant this to be a developer agreement, and we're just going to have to rewrite it in a way that makes that more clear.
Right, and we've worked really close with our HUD field office. I mean, they have given us great advice, and we do believe that we've done an assessment of is the developer fee reasonable and all of those types of things. So we're getting our way through it. It's just, and certainly for NSP3, we will be much better off knowing what we know now. So, but thank you for this. I really appreciate your time on the question.
Yeah, and there is you can request technical assistance, which in this case would be over the phone and by email if it HUD were to approve that.
Yes, and
Right.
they have mentioned that to us as recent as today, that we should go ahead and use that technical assistance, and we will do that.
Right. A
Thank
lot of
you.
these things are just kind of messy enough that it's more than you can deal with through the question box, or more than you can deal with, just over the phone. So,
Right.
that's definitely a resource for everybody. And we talk to the Phoenix folks on a regular basis, and so if they're having problems, they can call us. But I think it's better to get it straight and just to sort of acknowledge that. Well, look, we tried to do something, but we didn't do it right. So now we're fixing it. And
Right, and your point is very well taken. I mean, we have a lot of new home buyers out here, and their program is running well, and that's really, that's a good.
That's the big thing. But when we look at corrective actions, for example, I mean, if we were to say this is, and I don't think we necessarily would, but I mean, if we would have found this in a monitoring finding and you didn't realize you were doing it, our priorities are first to stop the problem from continuing, second to prevent it from happening again, and so that's essentially what you're doing now, and we don't have to assess monetary penalties or that sort of thing when there aren't any real problems that have occurred. It's just that I think a lot of folks have been having a crash course in development finance and development agreements, and the reason we're having this webinar today is that our field staff has been telling us, hey, there's all sorts of crazy stuff going on out here. Let's help people fix it.
Right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And Kent, do we have another question on the phone?
Yes,
a hand up?
Yes, we do. Let's go to Gedabeka. And there we go. Hi, are you there, Gedabeka?
Yeah, I'm here.
You've got a question about deal structures.
Well, the question was, we're a nonprofit developer, and we had an agreement with the grantee to develop, and we were told on two occasions, on a multifamily deal, the nonprofit developer was told they cannot be in an ownership structure. The proposal was the grantees and also a nonprofit, and we wanted to jointly own the multifamily unit. And we were told that this would be like a CDBG rule that says unfair compensation or whatever they called it.
So an apartment deal?
It's a multifamily apartment deal.
Okay, and you're a subrecipient of another nonprofit?
No, we have a development agreement.
Okay, development. Okay, but the grantees
is a nonprofit that we worked with over the years together on other projects. So we proposed to have a joint ownership.
Right. And where is this supposed undue enrichment or whatever coming in here?
It's from the administrators.
So, what are they looking at? I mean, is there such a great cash flow on this thing that you guys are going to be taking vacations to Brazil or something?
No, there won't be any cash flow. I mean, we haven't even developed it yet. In the initial phase, we're using the acquisition money for NSP funds, and then we have to yet raise debt financing to make the deal work.
Right.
So when we initially structured it as a 50-50 ownership, they said, no, you can't get into an ownership position.
Well, I think you should probably write this into the ask a question, but there may be situations where that's warranted, although I think I've heard of other situations where that happens. If it's are you saying that they're saying that it has to do with your status as a developer or your status as a nonprofit, or that they're just uncomfortable with the cash flow and what happens? No,
they didn't even go that far. It was just they just pulled out a CDBG rule. They said this would be looked as an undue enrichment because the nonprofit is coming into the deal with no equity in the deal.
Right. Well, let me clarify that. Something that we have been realizing here is that undue enrichment applies to for-profit developers. It doesn't apply to nonprofit developers. So nonprofit developers have to assure that their costs are reasonable, but that doesn't mean that they have to be bringing cash into the deal. My God, we wouldn't be doing anything if that were the case.
That was the exact argument, that you're not putting anything into the deal, so you just can't get into ownership position.
Well, this is Peter. Sounds like there would be a downside to this if the grantee jointly owns the property. It may not be a downside for you, but John, am I correct in saying that if the grantee is part owner, then the net rental income would be program income?
Well, it could be. It depends on how the
you know what? Let's keep the webinar to kind of general principles. This is a great question, but we really need to know all the details of the deal. So, if you don't mind, I think submitting it to ask a question, and if it gets too complex, certainly the on-call TA is available. So,
right. I put it into the ask a question. I mean, those things move through the system pretty quickly, and they also get us involved when they run up against sort of policy calls or internal HUD rulings or whatever that the TA providers can't get. So we meet on those every week, so it won't we should be able to get you an answer pretty quickly.
Kent, I think we need to move on through the presentation.
Sure. Keep going. Yep.
Okay, so we have talked about developer compensation. We've covered these points before. Of course, they can earn developer fees, potentially general contractor overhead and profit fees if the developer is acting also in the role of general contractor, and a sales fee. We're not encouraging you at all to overpay, certainly not double dip. These should be three distinct roles, and the fees for each of them should be reasonable and in line with the sort of market fees for these functions. But it is legitimate to structure an agreement that pays all three categories of fees. Now we get to the net proceeds of sale, which I hear from John and others that is kind of a recurring problem more and more. Developer doesn't own the net proceeds of sale. There can be arrangements, and I think it's been discussed in other webinars, how net proceeds might be left with a developer as sort of a restricted fund or an escrow for future projects. But it really would be, in the case of a for-profit undue enrichment, to let them keep the net proceeds of sale, and it probably would be seen as just not real good business principles to just let these net proceeds go and assume they're going to be properly used and so forth. So we see an awful lot of questions about this. As we work through a number of examples, it seems like the best solution is to have it remitted back to the grantee, or in some cases we've seen where it's gone into some kind of local trust fund to be reserved for similar work. So the basic idea is that you shouldn't assume the developer owns it. There have been some disputes over this. Obviously, when an agreement is silent, developer, particularly some of the for-profit developers who don't have a very easy road these days, trying to get all the profits they can out of these deals. So I know of one case where a developer got a fee and then demanded the net proceeds back in addition, and the agreement was silent. Now, that's a mistake. It's a mistake that actually constitutes, I would submit, a violation of NSP rules, the underlying CDBG rules. So this is a very important area to pay attention to.
Well, and I would just say that, the issue we're seeing is that people are realizing that there are these open ends in their agreements, and so the important point is to get your developers back in there, even though they don't have as much motivation to renegotiate as you might. You'd probably want to remind them that these things are almost always things that auditors find and can get into repayment. So, they're not going to, be able to get away with it, so to speak. So.
Yeah, we'll talk a little further on about how to, approach a renegotiation like that. We'll give you some tips on doing that. And John wanted me to spend a minute covering the developer fees, how to set them, just because there's so many questions that come up about this. We can't give you a certain answer because there's so many variables. One thing to look at, obviously, is what is paid in your market for similar types of development work. I think you'll find the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is a benchmark. Those are, I would typically consider those, not in every state, but in many states, kind of the upper end of what fees can be paid, because the tax credit developer usually has a 2 or 3 year project on their hands with an awful lot of preparation work, very complex financing work. So that's kind of an upper end, and just sort of what the local government has paid in other kinds of deals or other agencies in the state pay is certainly a benchmark. But in this chart, I don't want to go through the entire chart, but you can download this. But there are factors in favor, as we say, of lower fees, and there are factors in favor of higher fees. And generally, the less work the developer is doing, the less investment they have in the project, the quicker it goes. They're not paying holding costs. Those are things that would indicate them earning a lower fee. And if they're, on the other hand, doing a very complex project, the marketing and sales needs to be closely managed and is very difficult. They're absorbing all the internal overhead and project management costs. If they put up some of their own cash, they borrowed funds at risk. Especially if they have to pay holding costs out of the fee, those certainly would indicate a higher fee. So we'll take some questions on that if you have them. The other thing that agreements really need to address, or a program manual if you have one, is actually a better place to control this kind of detail would be a policies procedures manual. It gets very difficult to cover all these points in an addendum to a developer agreement, but basically these are checkpoints that we think should be written into agreements that give the grantee the right to approve or deny at these points. And the first one group would be the acquisition checkpoint, where we advise that you look at plans and specs or work write-up, sources and uses pro forma, have the environmental review done or certainly before the acquisition occurs, hopefully long before that, the relocation plan in place if necessary, and a project delivery schedule. Say this is multiple units that are going to be done at different times. So those are things that you should require. They're due diligence items, and again, you as a grantee have to reserve the right to say no. These aren't sufficient documents. They don't represent a good budget. We're underwriting this, and it doesn't look good. So you can approve or deny. Obviously, I don't think we need to say the things you need to do during construction. We're all pretty familiar with that. But another checkpoint is it's kind of overlooked, is the settlement sheet for the final closing when a home is sold. I'm not sure everyone's aware, but these settlement sheets are drafted before the closing, often a week or two before the closing. These really need to be reviewed, and you need to have the right to review it to make sure that the developer is not, say, taking out too much money in terms of net proceeds. They can certainly, you can allow the final developer fee installment, sales agent fee, and other costs to come out of net proceeds, but that's a very important checkpoint. So here's an example of a disposition of net proceeds. I'm not going to spend a long time on this at all, but the house sells for $100,000, which is generally speaking, should be the market value, should determine the price. Developer closing costs come out of that, that's fine. Final installment of fee, sales agent fee. Let's say the developer took out a $40,000 loan from their favorite bank to cover the rehab costs because NSP didn't cover them. That's perfectly legitimate to come out of the gross proceeds. And then out of that, in this equation, you also take out any homebuyer assistance that's converted to a second mortgage, and you have out of that net proceeds. So we actually, one of the tools we put up in the Learning Center, it's not available in the toolkit yet, is a thing, I think it's identified as project budget with analysis of net proceeds. And I think you could find that very useful to adapt and even attach as a required document, either for your developer agreements or require that it be part of the due diligence items that you approve when you approve an acquisition. Let's say you have an agreement that allows developers to buy multiple units. So very important control feature is the budget. And again, if you have a single property agreement, that budget should be with the agreement. If it's a blanket agreement that allows future acquisitions, you should have a checkpoint where they submit this budget. And in the interest of time, I'm not going to go through all of these points. You can go back and refer to this, but really keep in mind that the grantee has a right and obligation to control fees and costs, and we would submit even those that are not NSP funded. We've heard some grantees say, well, if we were funding the project, we'd only allow a 10% developer fee, but because others are participating and they allow 15%, well, all well and good. But just to remind you that you with your NSP funds are funding the feasibility gap, and the higher the costs go, the more money you have to put up. Conversely, if the costs like developer fees can be controlled, you will save some money for future projects. So we'd again say that you do have the right and obligation to control all the costs if you're helping to finance the deal. We think this is a really useful way to look at a budget. This is one format that shows total cost, NSP funded by others. It's not a complete budget, it just shows you kind of the line items. But that's a really great way to think about a project, and we'd suggest you use a format like that. So you're starting in the project in the beginning with all this not only NSP money budgeted, but you knowing that other sources are funding the total cost. So you have a complete development cost budget. Just a moment here, it kind of goes back to a previous point of controlling costs. This isn't just controlling costs, but we suggest that you really need some criteria, written criteria. They'd be referred to in the developer agreement if they're in a separate document. They might be written into the developer agreement, probably better to do that, as to what the maximum NSP funding, say, per unit would be, maximum development subsidy, write down, and the maximum allowed amounts of homebuyer assistance. These are all things that determine, ultimately, how much money is used temporarily in a unit, which speaks to whether they're leveraging other money or not. But most importantly, it allows you to control how much funding stays in a project. We've worked with a couple of grantees that I have to say aren't doing that underwriting at all. There's a blanket amount they've given to developers. There's not necessarily a firm requirement to do 1, 2, or 3 units with that money. It's very flexible, and we think that's not a good situation, that there should be this underwriting step. Ensuring NSP compliance. I'm sure everyone on this call, if they've attended any other webinars, is familiar with all these compliance issues. I won't go through the list, but any agreement should have this list of and details on these typical federal requirements, not to mention state and local requirements for insurance, permits, and so forth. Very important. And the developer agreement templates in the NSP toolkit, I think most of them, if not all of them, have a sample section like this, and we certainly recommend you use those or amend them. Just to the point of what's not applicable, we mentioned earlier developers are not subject to the same requirements as nonprofits. And again, in the interest of time, we're running a little over here. So I'd just refer you to this PowerPoint, but also, more importantly, to some of the agreement templates that have very specific language about what developers are subject to and not subject to, as compared to subrecipients. Okay, one of our last points on the terms of the agreement is monitoring and enforcement. Of course, we've talked about those checkpoints earlier. That's where your monitoring comes in. Your key checkpoint, this probably goes without saying, is approving payments or not. That's the time to get all your due diligence documents in, to review them, to take them seriously, and to deny payment, even to the point of denying an acquisition going ahead if things aren't as they should be. And other enforcement, so to speak, if you don't have an or else, this agreement is going to possibly get you in trouble. So you need a clear ability to cancel a developer's budget allocation for cause. We think it's highly advisable, even if you have this in an agreement, to impose a lien on the property for the amount of the NSP funding. This is not happening in every instance. There are deed restrictions being filed. There are simply agreements that have no filing in the real estate records. Therefore, it is conceivable that any developer could go out and get another loan on it that would be not just senior, it would be the only secured funding on the property, which could open things up to abuse. But more importantly, it just gives you a way to make sure you get repaid, for instance, that net proceeds of sale. So we think in almost all cases you should seriously consider having a lien on the property for the amount of NSP funding that you put in during the development period. If it's a rental project, that funding, some of it or all of it, could roll into the permanent financing. So, a few more questions at this point. Kent, do you want to take over?
Yeah, and let's go to Samit. Samit, are you there?
Am I here?
I'm here.
Oh, sorry.
Hello?
Hi.
Hello?
Go ahead. You had a concern about not incurring program income with Habitat and how to structure the loan with them?
Yes, and then I did hear you state that it was not considered undue enrichment because the state is telling us that how we structured our loan, and we're trying to work out the kinks, it's all NSP subsidy. We don't have a first for the recipients for the homes. That's how we structured it. And they're saying if we structure it that way, it looks like there would be undue enrichment to Habitat.
Well, I said that it wouldn't be termed undue enrichment. I think you still need to specify what they'll do with those funds. But with an organization like Habitat or other groups that are only doing these kinds of activities, we're less concerned that it's going to end up in somebody's pocket or whatever. I mean, it's not to say it wouldn't happen, but for the most part, it's less of an issue that it's open-ended, but you really need to close that off either way and specify that, well, you're going to keep doing NSP-eligible properties until, that money runs out, or, however you set it up so that you have some sense of what's going on, and ideally they'll be telling you what they're doing with the money down the road.
We helped negotiate this with one local NSP grantee and their local Habitat affiliate. And what was agreed on very amicably was that the NSP funds would go into the acquisition or rehab or new construction. Usually the acquisition was nil because they already owned property. The terms were that it was written in the developer agreement, and also that the funding would roll from the development financing into the permanent financing. So the only thing, there was no return to Habitat at the time of sale. There were no cash proceeds of sale. So the NSP funding essentially became part of the 20-year mortgage that this nonprofit wrote. And the only thing the agreement said about this was that the NSP funded portion of those mortgages had to be returned, used in a revolving loan fund to make future loans like that. Otherwise, it would be arguably unrestricted funds. They could use it to pay salaries and so forth. I think arguably that could be permitted, but this grantee and the Habitat group wanted to make sure that money remained capital that could be used to write mortgages. So that was an amicable solution, I think a good one, and there was language in the agreement that said that these funds will stay in a revolving loan fund that is a restricted account, and they will audit that account and provide audits on request.
Right. Given the seller financing that Habitat does as a typical way of doing business, that makes a lot of sense, and they'll get some funds out of that gradually, but it just feeds back into their regular work.
So I'm going to keep giving pitches for on-call TA. If you're stuck on these terms, the different providers who respond to this generally all have a set of examples and documents that might be a quick way to fix this. I'd say it's probably a little too complicated for an AAQ. But if you're stuck on this and need help, certainly there are folks who can help you resolve this pretty quickly, and certainly keep in touch with the field office about what you're doing.
Right, and I would just say that we can authorize up to 16 hours, which is enough to solve most problems, I think, or we could expand it if we have to. But we go through those every week, so this isn't something you're going to have to wait months for. We can turn those requests around at least every week and get that right out to you.
Kent, do you want to take a few more questions?
Yep. Let's go to Catherine Pekowski, and I'll unmute you. Are you there, Catherine?
Yes, I'm here.
Great. Can you go over your question about developer fees?
It's about sales proceeds. We're a developer, and we had an agreement in the beginning to use sales proceeds to complete an additional number of units. So, the units were purchased, and then the state decided that all the sales proceeds had to be returned. So this is leaving us as a developer without the funds to complete all the units that had been acquired. It's a difference of opinion between the developers, the grant subrecipients, and the state. What's the best way that we can get this resolved? We've tried contacting representatives at the state head office. We're still working on it.
Let me take a first pass at this, and I think John probably has some additional comments. Well, this is tough to comment on because we don't have the agreements in front of us, but let me assume this, that the agreement you originally signed very clearly said you could keep net proceeds to invest in additional units. And you, on the basis of that, you relied on this agreement to go out and acquire properties that you thought you could use this money on.
Correct.
I'm going to guess that the language of the agreement wasn't very specific about the reuse part of it. But nonetheless, you know, if it's fairly specific, you know, there's a lot of what-ifs here, but it sounds like it may have been a valid agreement. Now, they're demanding it to undo some of the terms of the agreement, and this gets so into contract law and NSP rules and so forth that, you know, I just don't think we can say a lot more on the phone, and I think, you know, we could, through AAQ, better yet the on-call, I mean, we could analyze the agreement, but TA provider is not authorized to offer legal advice, and I'm not doing it now, but it is certainly about the enforceability of the agreement. That's a question for your attorney. Having said all that, if you could work out something amicable where you go in and change it, and you know, you work out something where you do get those funds back, they go into program income, but they reserve those funds for you. That'd probably be the best out.
We're trying to do that. We've already hired an attorney who's, you know, sent up comments. We're just at an impasse. We're at a complete impasse. So I didn't know if there was any other, you know, avenue for the NSP technical assistance to move forward.
Well, when you
John, do you want to take a stab at this? I mean, we could look at the agreement, but I don't think any TA provider can say whether or not they have a, you know, a valid case to enforce the agreement. That's a legal opinion.
So, you're talking to the state, or are you talking to the HUD field office, or both?
Both.
Okay. And the HUD field office is saying what?
The state decides.
Okay. All right. Well,
I mean, all we want to do is just finish the units that we've already acquired and then return any other funding.
Right. Okay. Why don't you send me an email that describes what's going on, you know, it's kind of summary, and we can start looking into it and seeing who's saying what here. I agree with Peter, it's probably a legal issue for starters, but even if you've got a strong agreement and they're asking for the money back, then, you know, that doesn't seem to be solving the problem. So I think my email address is going to be listed somewhere at the end of this. But it's John A. Laswick at HUD.gov, and this is going to take some digging.
Thank you, Catherine. And let's see, where is Charles had a question, which is it required by HUD for a nonprofit that has been awarded a developer agreement to follow federal procurement rules, even if procurement requirements were not written into the developer agreement?
Well, if all the facts are as presented here, no. It's not required that you follow the procurement rules that would apply to a local government, a unit of government, or a nonprofit. You can designate contractors, building contractors, service providers, such as appraisers and so forth. You do not have to go through the procurement rules.
What is required is that
we don't see your agreement, of course, and there may be some details in there that we don't understand. Certainly a grantee's right to tell you, well, you may be a developer and you may have the right to designate all these contractors, but we want you to bid it. That would be within their right. So if that is in the agreement, you know, that you need to do that, then you have to do it.
But assuming it's not in the agreement, you do have to demonstrate that your costs are reasonable. So, I mean, bidding is one way that you do that, but there are other ways to do that. And even a developer that's got a general contractor that they work with all the time. I mean, those people go out and get quotes on the major work elements and so forth. So if that's happening, it doesn't have to be a formal closed bid type of a sealed bid process that governments typically go through, but you can establish that you have found that costs were reasonable in a number of different ways. That's one of them. You can use comparable cost data from professional advisory services and that sort of thing. But Peter's right. If it's in the agreement, they can require it. But I think you said it wasn't. So.
Okay. Well, we're running a little long with this. There's a lot of details. I'd like to move on to the last section. It's not too long, and then we'll take questions even after that. But now we're on to how you do renegotiate agreements. What are the triggers? This has come up a number of times. From a grantee standpoint, one problem would be them not meeting their spending deadlines. They're not moving fast enough. If there were clear terms in the agreement about their spending deadlines, then they could be certainly out of compliance. In any case, it's a problem. The terms of the NSP funding eligible uses weren't spelled out clearly. Existing agreement was wrong or silent in relationship to NSP or CDBG regs, which usually would make the agreement or certain actions out of compliance, because almost all agreements say you must comply with applicable state, federal, and local laws. And so that again would be a form of contract violation, so to speak. Maybe it's not a lack of clarity or lack of following rules, not a default, but the developer simply wants more subsidy or higher fees. We have seen agreements negotiated where fees seem radically low, like in the $2,000 to $3,000 a unit, which would not even cover the developer's overhead. We've seen projects that didn't have enough subsidy to do what the grantee and the developer wanted to do. So if there can be amicable negotiations on this, you certainly have the right to change those terms. But if a developer is just sort of strong-arming you to get more money out of a deal because they didn't do their budget right or didn't manage the project well, that sounds more like a default where you don't reward folks for a mistake. One of the questions came up, this is kind of esoteric, if you will, but it does come up, that the identity of the developer wasn't clear in the agreement. It put down a nonprofit when it was an LLC controlled by the nonprofit or a for-profit. It had a somewhat related organization that was really doing the development. So it's very important at the application stage, at the proposal stage, to be absolutely clear about the legal entity that you're dealing with. Not the one necessarily that's applied to you, but the one that'll be the developer. Those mistakes do happen. So how do you go about, this has come up a couple of times, things that are out of kilter. Talking about the grantee here, but also we had one developer that says, they're being asked to do something that they didn't agree to. But let's look at it from the grantee's point of view. How do you renegotiate agreement? Well, one clear piece of advice is if a developer's in default, you can declare default. And that becomes, shall we say, kind of a leverage to renegotiate things. Or you may just want to go through with closing out the agreement and moving on to another developer. But a lot of these agreements were, shall we say, not really completely thought out. It's a new program. There were a lot of unknowns. There were a lot of guidance that came out over time. And even if, it was an unintentional error, a lot of agreements just, as it mentions at the bottom here, could be considered null and void because they did not cover some requirements. So, like, for instance, if they're silent on net proceeds of sale, completely silent, and I were negotiating with a developer, I'd say, look, it's silent on this, but, we can't give you the net proceeds because if you're a for-profit, because it would be undue enrichment. We're not going to do it. And so, we can either amicably settle this and amend the agreement, or, let's talk about canceling it out. So sometimes you have to play hardball to get the developer to come to the table and renegotiate. I think there are a lot more cases where this can be done by mutual agreement. I've seen it quite a few times already, where it's in everyone's interest to clean up the agreement and make it workable. So here's just some suggestions here of what sort of positive reinforcement might help bring the developer to the table. Remind them that if you need to, that you want to have a long-term relationship, you'd think it's in their interest to preserve that. Certainly don't want to have any negative audit findings coming out of this. So, if the developer isn't really completely in default, which gives you a lot of leverage to renegotiate, you can still use persuasion. So I just want to mention, we mentioned all through here, I won't go over every point here, but there are a lot of appropriate documents in the toolkits that you might want to use. I would point out that some, rather than others, as opposed to others, are cross-reference each other, so you really look at them carefully and note the other documents they reference or cross-reference. For example, there are a couple of developer agreement templates that refer to specific program manuals or loan agreements and so forth. So the more you find a little set that's cross-referenced with each other, the better off you'll be using these as templates. And here are just some names of the downloads. I'm not going to read these off. You can go in and download this PowerPoint. There's also a guide, second to the bottom item here, the guide to negotiating. Here it is, right here. Oop, very messy. Guide. You should have instructed me better. I'm not very good at this. Guide to negotiating developer agreements has a whole list of documents that you may want to look at. There's assistance available. We've referred to ask a question. We think it's appropriate primarily for focused questions about NSP compliance. If it's you're asking a lot of questions about a developer agreement and the TA provider doesn't see that agreement, doesn't know the context, doesn't know the concerns of the person on the other side of the table, whether that's a grantee or a developer, it's very tough to give accurate answers. So on these developer agreements, by and large, unless it's just a real straightforward policy question, it seems like on-call TA generally works much better so that somebody can actually read the agreement and learn about the context. So lastly, this is the links you go to. Again, we won't hover on this or spend any time on it, but you can go back and look to these links for resources. We want to save a little time for additional questions and answers. And please give us your feedback. If you have to sign off now, we really, really appreciate you giving us feedback. Tell us how we can do a better job or what parts of this presentation you like the best, so we can present future webinars that are useful to you. We appreciate that. But So in the meantime, let's go to more questions and answers. And Kent, when do we need to close this out?
We have up to a half hour if the questions last that long, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay.
Audrey has been waiting very patiently for some time. Hi, Audrey. How are you? Audrey Spencer Horsley, are you there?
Yes, I am, but you've answered my question. Thank you.
Okay, great. If you could just click your lower hand button, that would be helpful. Thanks. And let's go back to Becca.
Yeah, my question was kind of nonprofit developer.
Oh,
I'm having trouble
can't
hearing
hear you. Yep, can't hear you.
Hello?
That's better. Yep.
Yeah, the question was, can a nonprofit developer be the beneficiary of a second mortgage assistance?
Yeah, Rebecca, I think you're on a speakerphone. You're going to have to get closer or pick up the receiver.
Okay, I was just asking, can a nonprofit developer be the beneficiary of a second mortgage assistance given to a home buyer and then reuse that for future buyers in the future?
So the answer, this is subject to John Laswick saying I'm wrong, but I believe that in almost any instance where the grantee wants to allow that and controls how you reuse the proceeds, that there's some control language, that would be okay. And we already referred to an example of the habitat groups where we've worked out arrangements where they it's not quite the same. They use the NSP funds to fund a first mortgage, and they simply agree to, in their agreement, to return the payments on that mortgage into a revolving loan fund to make future loans. So, John, any comments on that? I don't see any problems if it's well documented.
I agree. You might find some useful instructions in the program income policy alert that came out, I think, in June, this past June of this year. There was a little bit of confusion about, cash flow on multifamily deals. If this is just single family and you're going to be getting a lump sum or payments over time, then, that's just program. Those are just revenues to a developer that could be allowed in the development agreement to be used for other similar projects.
Okay, thank you.
Welcome. Kent, do we have more questions?
We do, and I'll get to Verna in just a second. But first, I want to let you know that that there are sample written agreements and other files relating to this topic for both single-family rental and for home ownership programs, and they will be posted here.
They're already up.
Yeah, they're up, and they'll also at some point it'll go from upcoming session to the archive in the previously held session. I imagine that'll happen very shortly, so you can get to see a number of examples of developer agreements and other files relating to this. You can also know that there are a number of more HUD webinars, NSP webinars coming up, starting the day after tomorrow with an open forum, Q&A. 3 more in December, and there wasn't enough room to fit all of the ones in January on this slide, but they go to the 17th and beyond. So I hope you come back for some more of those. And now let's go to Verna. Hello, Verna.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, how is everyone this afternoon?
Good. Doing well, and if you could speak up a little more, that would be helpful.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm calling from Memphis, and I just had a question regarding multifamily rehab. And I know that you all have gone over earlier in the presentation that if it's a developer, they can pretty much do what's reasonable if you do not bid the project. But in our case, the developer is moving forward with a bid process, and the question has come up if the developer can execute a cost fee with guarantee price type contract with the contractor.
Could you explain, Verna, a little more what you mean by cost fee with guaranteed price? I honestly
I guess it's a fix if they could negotiate, or we've run into a situation. We've gone out to bid once, and it was just way out of alignment. So we're going back now with suggesting that the developer fix or specifically state that this is the budget. And if the numbers are still out of skelter, that they can enter into some sort of cost fee with guarantee, that they would be allowed a fee with a guaranteed price, meaning the developer or the contractor would assume all risk at that point if anything goes over price.
So you're basically saying, can the developer enter into a fixed price contract with a builder? Is that correct?
That's correct.
And yes, I mean that's preferable, far preferable. I would just caution you this. I mean, if all the bids have come in high and suddenly the developer comes up with a fixed price bid, say from a general contractor that's 10 or 20% below all the bids you've had before, I would really have your construction experts go over that with a fine-tooth, because it could be underbid and you'll just get into trouble later. I mean, it could, the GC might have promised a fixed fee, but they don't complete. I don't know how big a project it is. If they've got a bid bond, a bond on the work.
They do.
So that's a lot of assurance. So I'd say you're probably okay if you've checked it for cost reasonableness, and not that it's just too high, but too low as well, and it's bonded. Sounds like you should be fine.
Right.
John, do you have anything more to say about that?
No.
Okay, well, I'm headed to the architect's office now and meet the developer, but I just wanted
fixed price is great. Cost plus contracts are not great. They're open-ended. So
exactly. But like I said, you made a very good point in terms of your bid documents being very tight. And that, to me, is the key of making sure that you're communicating well, especially for a rehab. And it's difficult.
You've got to have specs that you can do a very accurate cost takeoff from, plans and specs. You've got to be able to figure out square footage of carpet and drywall and, have rooms to paint and squares of roofing. If you can't figure that, it's a little less sure it's going to get done. But if, they say they're going to do all the drywall and all the roofing and so forth for a fixed price, and there's a bid bond, and it's, say, within a cost that you've seen before or can verify, then it's great. Just much better than cost plus. That's
I think when you're having rehab, it's always those hidden things like the structural, without having to rip out everything. I mean, we ripped out just about everything through our environmental.
That's why you hold about 10%, even in, if it's a real old building with a lot of unknowns, maybe even a 15% contingency that you would approve only with change orders. But it's very important to have that contingency. But I will say a lot of so-called hidden problems weren't really hidden at all, and the spec writer just missed a bunch of stuff.
Right, and or a lot more investigation up front, and especially I find it's in site infrastructure where you end up losing yourself on most of these rehabs. So.
Right.
I appreciate that. I just wanted clarification on that. Thank you.
Good luck with that. I think we can take a few more questions, Kent, if there are any.
At the moment, I see none.
Let me put I want to put a plug in for Peter's. Peter's one of the items listed that are available on the Resource Exchange Learning Center is this guide to writing and changing NSP developer agreements, which is a brand new kind of guideline that has several just sort of charts that go over a lot of the issues that we talked about today, maybe a little more detail or maybe more, kind of more particulars. And so I think you ought to take advantage of that. I think Peter is probably selling himself a little bit short on the guide to the development agreements and the manual, the development agreement and the manual for single-family homes, which he wrote and I think are really useful for being plain English kind of versions to this. Your attorneys might not like it, but you'll understand it, and I think that's probably more important. So, you don't have to adopt all these things, but you if you understand what's at stake, you're going to be much better off.
Good. Again, you'll be taken to a survey when you leave this event, and please take a moment to answer those questions, give us some feedback. We always appreciate especially your written comments. And I'd like to thank Peter for all his time preparing for today's webinar and for preparing all the sample documents that John was just mentioning. To John for your help in answering questions, and Hunter today. And I guess that's it. So we look forward to seeing you on a future NSP webinar. Next one is Thursday. Take care, everyone.